Last video we worked on a resolver for logging in users, and one part of logging in users is keeping them logged in, because a lot of time when you revisit a website you don't want to have to put your credentials in again. So the way we're going to be doing this, because right now we don't have any code in here to actually do that, we're basically just returning null if we get a good login, and if we get a bad login we're throwing an error. So to actually persist users and keep them logged in, what we're going to do is send back a cookie. And this cookie is going to have an ID in it. And we're going to create a unique ID per user. And we're going to store some information on that user in the server. And then whenever that user makes a request, we can look up their data given the ID that they send with their cookie. So there's a nice library to help us out with this, and it is called Express Session. So this is what we're going to be setting up today. So first things first, we need to install it. So let's come on over here. I'm going to do yarn add express session, and then I'm also going to install the types for it. And we're going to set this up in our start server, and this is middleware for Express. And we can do yarn add types express session. Alright, so when that's done installing, we'll go ahead and import it. I'm trying to decide whether we need to add types, or not types, but the session middleware for this route right here. I guess it would be kind of nice to see if the user confirms their email, but I actually changed my mind because we're going to have a setting where we don't track them until they actually log in. This might be something we change later though. Either way, I'm going to add it right here. So we're going to say server.express.use, and then we're going to pass in our middleware right here. So we're using GraphQL Yoga, but we can access Express right here, and we can add any type of middleware. And that's how we were able to add this route right here as well. Alright, let's go ahead and import it. So import, and it's going to be, I'll just call it session from Express session. And I think, yep, we just need to import it like that. And then the settings that I like to use for this are the ones that I've done in a previous video. So I'm going to explain how these work. We're going to use these two bits right here, because we also need to set up cores, which I'll talk about in a second. And we can get rid of that. Alright, and there's going to be one quick difference, and that is we're also going to be using Redis. But that's a separate library we're going to add. But if you want to see any of these settings or what they mean in more detail, check out the README. They explain it quite well. But here we go. We set up the session object, and the first thing I specify the name. I call it QID. The reason why you want to give it a name, it can really be just something. The default one is just called ID, and so it's nice to just make it different so people don't know right away just from the cookie name that you're using this library. I don't know why I called it QID. You could call it anything. I could call it BID, any letter. I just gave it a random one. Secondly, we need to specify a secret for it. We can go ahead and say const session secret is going to be something like that, and you probably want to pick a better secret. What I'll do next video is in between them I'll add this to my environment file. I don't want to open it right now because I have my API key in there, and then we'll get it from the environment instead of just having the secret here, because it's not a good idea to have your secrets in your source code. Next, this is resaving. I turn this off. What this does is if you get a session, so let's say someone has an ID and the cookie ID, and they contact your site or they hit your server, make a request I mean, you don't want to basically resave their session every single time. You can turn that on, but I'm just going to keep it off because we only really need to store it once and then just update it if we want to. We don't need to save it every time. This is the save uninitialized. What this means is we don't store anything about the user, or we don't create a cookie for the user until I actually store some data on them. And this will make more sense in a second. And this bit right here is just settings for cookie. Here, HTTP only is very important. What this means is JavaScript cannot access your cookie, which is important for security. And then here, this is for secure. Secure is for HTTPS, so it'll only send the cookie over HTTPS. This is really important for production, and you should be running HTTPS in production, so this shouldn't be a problem. So I have this little setting right here where I check whether we're in production. If we are, we turn it on. If not, we're not running HTTPS in development, so we turn it off. And then lastly, here's the max age. This is just how long you want the cookie to persist for. 7 days is what I have right now. I might change this to a really big number, like a year or something later. I haven't decided how long I want the cookie to last for. The other thing is here's setting cores. I don't know if this will cause an issue with our testing, but we have the credentials to true, so we can send a cookie back. And then we also origin. This is basically where our front end is located. So our front end is localhost 3000. This will change depending on where my localhost or my front end is going to be. But for now, I'll put that. And we just pass the cores to the server right here. So cores, it's a setting you pass to that. And yeah, so that is all set up. I mentioned Redis before, so that's one thing we're going to add. So we're going to be using this thing called connect Redis. And actually, let me show you guys. If we scroll down, we can store the data and look at all these different places. So I mentioned we're going to store data for each user. So we can store this data in a number of different places. I'm going to choose to store it in Redis, but you could store it in any number of these places. Redis is a really good choice because it's fast, and we're already using it for some other stuff. So that's perfect. Another good one probably would be like memcached, but you could also store it, for example, in Postgres, which you wouldn't even need another service if you wanted to, since we're already using Postgres. But all of these are different choices you can have, but you can see Redis is a very popular one. So let's go ahead and install this. And we're also going to need to install the types for it. I did not copy that correctly. And we're just going to import it and then add it as one of the options to our session. And then automatically it'll start storing the data in Redis instead of just by default it stores the session data just in memory, so when you start your server everything refreshes. This will persist stuff. So connect Redis. So alright, so we have the types and now we can import this guy. So import and I think we just add it. Yep, so we just say Redis store, and then we can just pass the store, and we can pass it any options. Here are the options here. We can just do the default ones though. So we'll say store, and we'll say new Redis store, and let's go ahead and import that. So we'll call it Redis store, and connect dash Redis. Alright, cool. And I forgot a comma. And what is it? Oh, it just wants some arguments. You can pass in an empty object. Only a void function. Okay, it's not liking this. Maybe I need just import it like that. Oh, it has no default import. And when I install it like that, it doesn't like it either. Okay, so what I always forget when using this library is we need to pass in the session that we're using. So express session up here, and then we can create a new Redis store. So what I'm going to do is up here, I'll just call this, I'll call this connect Redis. And then I'll create a store. So const Redis store is equal to connect Redis, passing in our express session. And then here I don't need to pass in, I guess we do still need to pass in empty object. Okay, so we're all good for setting up sessions, so we can actually use this now. So in our login resolver over here, and actually there's one last thing I forgot. We actually have to pass it in. So down here, actually it's wherever we do context. Okay, context is right here. So in our request now that we've added this middleware, request is going to have a session inside of it. So we can pass, I'm just going to pass in request like so. And now we can access requests in any of our resolvers. And the thing we want to access on request is that session object. So in my login resolver, all the way at the bottom, so assuming, login successful. So what we want to do is add a cookie or create a cookie for that user. And the way we do it is I'm going to say request.session, and we're getting request from the context. So I'm just going to come up here and I'm going to say request, and we're going to have to change our resolver map because we have a new item in our context. So in our resolver map, we also now have a request, which is a request from not node fetch, from express. Alright, so that's what this guy is, and we now have a session. And what we can do is we could look at anything inside of this session, or we can set something. So we're going to set the user ID, and that's going to be coming from the user that we just logged in. So we found a user up here, so we're going to save its ID in the session, and I guess it's possibly undefined request.session. So we can do a little check, I suppose. So if request.session, we want to do this thing. Otherwise, I guess we want to throw an error basically. So if the login is not successful, or I guess the login is still successful, but if we don't have access to the session object, something went wrong. And maybe we should just assume that session is defined. And I think that's probably the best case, because we could log it, but I think it's just going to be a problem with the library itself. So I'm going to say request.session, and we're just going to cast it as any. And what I think I'm going to do at a later state is when we start adding more things to our session is we'll actually specify a type. And maybe I'll want to do this slightly differently now that I think of it. So I think in my types over here, what I want to actually export as well is just an interface for the type, or for the session. And so in the session, we know we want to store maybe a user ID, which will be a string. And in our start server over here, instead of passing the whole request object, what I think I'll just pass in is the session. And this will be request.session. And so in our context over here, we're now going to have a session. So request is now becoming session, and we could have done session. So we could do it like I was doing before, but I think I like this a little bit better. And we don't need that. So this is us just setting the session ID. And we get this from the context still. Okay, so what this will do is, I mentioned earlier in start server that we have save uninitialized to false. What this means is it will not set a cookie for the person that made the request until we actually change the session. So express session looks for whenever you make changes. So we made a change here to the session object, and when we make a change to the session object, it then creates a cookie and stores the data. So it's going to store the user ID for this user. So then what we can do is whenever that user makes a request to our server again, we can look at session.userid to see what their user ID is. And that's pretty much it for creating a cookie for the user, at least when they log in. We will be doing some more stuff in the future with this. And I'm not sure, I don't think I want to add any tests particularly for this, because this is pretty much just testing whether express session works, and we shouldn't need to test that. That should be someone else's job. But I do want to test that this integrates and works with other requests, which we will be doing, that the stuff persists and whatnot. And I do want to, before we end this video, run our tests and make sure I didn't break anything, because we now have some other stuff. And looks like no tests even ran by default, so I'll do A to run them all, and we'll see what happens. The only thing I could see, okay, so here's what I was wondering about. So now that we have Redis, so make sure, I guess duplicate key violates unique constraint. I'm guessing it's because we might be passing in 2 Redis clients. So right here, when we create a new Redis store, we're creating a connection, and we are already creating a Redis connection over here. And if we look at the setup over here, it looks like they use Node Redis, which is different than what we were using, but it does say down here that it's compatible. So right here, it's compatible with other Redis clients like IO Redis, which is what we're using. So let's try that. So we can pass as a parameter the client, which we can pass in Redis. Doesn't look like it likes it, so I'm just going to cast it, and let's see if that works. We'll let this run all the tests. If this doesn't work, I'll have to do some investigation. Yeah, so I'll do some investigation and see what's going on. It looks like we just broke our Redis connection for some reason. I guess maybe the Redis store is maybe clearing possibly the values that are not in Redis or not pertain to the Redis store. I'll have to look in and see what it's doing. But that's it for this video, guys. In the next one, we'll fix this error and continue working on the next steps.